So how is it that we ourselves measure time? And this is a very fascinating study because our sense of time is merely due to the rotation of celestial bodies. And the rotation of these celestial bodies give us what is known today as our standard year. And it is a repeating cycle in which we use to measure existence itself. Now, the study of time also relates to many other studies. And we can relate the study back to Leonardo and the Vitruvian Man and the concept of squaring the circle and fitting the man himself both within the square and the circle. The circle itself represents eternity, in which there is really no initial starting point. And the relation of man within the circle is the relation between the microcosmic world within the man and the macrocosmic world, which is the reflection of what is inside. The inside, hence, then becomes the outside. And what we see is that the eternal existence of man coinciding with the universe itself is in relation to, really no beginning and no end. And so as we ourselves attempt to travel through time, we must in a lot of ways recognize the eternal cycle of things with no mere initial point and no really end to things. But for us to gain an experience, we must utilize the square and we must rationalize our measurements. And so by finding ourselves within the square, we can then define specific beginning points and ending points to lengths of time. And in doing so, we can further define our experience. And by further defining our experience along a timeline itself, we can then gain a further sense of experience, giving us a sense of perception, which allows us to then actually travel through time because we can designate specific moments of time along a certain line with, in a sense, a beginning and an end, giving us experience, giving us life. So we see this old conundrum and problem where people try to recognize eternia, but then also to rationalize things along a timeline itself. And by utilization of the two, as seen within the Vitruvian Man itself, we're able to harmonize the concept of eternal nature of all things, yet at the same moment in time, rationalize beginnings and endings. And by doing so, we're able to separate ourselves from things just enough while preserving, in a sense, life itself, allowing us to then travel somewhere distant, which would otherwise be, an impossible feat. So by preserving life within the circle and by utilization of eternal concepts, we're able to overcome the rational ones. And by utilization then of the rational ones, we're still able to hold on to what it means to actually experience things in a linear manner, giving us a sense of perspective along the whole grand scheme of things. And this sense of perspective allows us to actually travel through time itself, because without this experience, we wouldn't necessarily have experience and be able to experience what we're experiencing. So the whole concept relates back to, the initial problems with traveling through space itself. And that being able to maintain homeostasis while, in a sense, being able to traverse large distances of time and space. And so we see the circle and the square presenting itself in that manner. And, that's why when you travel through automobile to another location, you must, in essence, close yourself off from the external world in relation to your ability to still perceive and experience what is going on. Yet, at the same point in time, you still have to take into consideration the notions of maintaining life itself. and maintaining your linear pathway of things so that you don't necessarily fall into the chaotic mess of, you know, eternity. So it's this constant balance of being able to retrospectively view the world in both terms at the same time and being able to apply both things at the same time, taking advantage of one while taking simultaneously the advantage of the other, so that we can, in a sense, retain our consciousness and our experience of what has been and what is going to be, so that we can actually experience it and be able to ourselves be something which has lived through it. And then as we ourselves have been able to live through it, we're able to effectively communicate and to share that experience with other individuals, making a practical means and way in which to travel through time itself. Not only back in time, but, forward in time as well. Merely awaiting for a certain time to align itself and being at the right time, at the right moment, to us ourselves, finding ourselves in that time. Well, thank you for joining me on this journey through time and through relation of events. And as always, have a great day. One man's Stargate is another man's carport, allowing himself to enter into another dimension of space itself. And by closing himself off from another portion, he is opening up another dimension, so to speak, which enables him to take advantage of the physical laws of the universe as we know them, and to allocate himself to a new space and to a new time, it may seem. For time itself is merely a place in space. And so going to another time is merely yourself going to another place in space. It's like a river, and the river is constantly flowing. And the fact that the river is flowing itself allows us to experience change, allows us to get a sense of duration. And it is through these sensations that we gain ourselves a sense of life. Without change and without this sense of duration and without the sense of time, would we ourselves necessarily experience what we deem to be life itself? Now, how to travel through time and space? Well, as we so eloquently described before, and has been described in Equation itself, time and the material world are linked. So to travel through time, you merely have to travel through space and through what you perceive to be the space around you. And by doing so, you're traveling through time. Now, the means by which you do so allows you to take further advantage upon the concept of time itself to gain the advantage of traveling further through time. For example, by entering into this dimension which separates myself from the external world, I am able to reduce my friction on the external world and to retain my perception of the external world at the same time, giving me a sense of traveling through space, and while doing so, traveling through time to another location, but at the same time maintaining my consciousness, which allows me to experience the experience as it is happening. Because, like I stated before, time is merely in direct relation to the material world. And if I myself were to unconsciously travel through time without being able to perceive it, then would I truly be able to gain the experience of what time is itself? And in not necessarily being able to experience traveling through time, I wouldn't necessarily be able to be alive, because being alive requires the experience of progress. And so it requires us to separate ourselves from the external world to, in a sense, take greater leaps through time. And thus we gain innovations such as the automobile, where we are, in a way, in a time delay from our external world through a separation from it. And it is this separation from it which allows us to maneuver through space at an accelerated manner while still retaining our perception of space itself. And, as physics describes, the body in motion, all things within the body itself are in motion. However, within the body that has space within it, being defined as another dimension, things are still able to move and accelerate within the space that is itself moving and accelerating, which is a fairly fanciful concept to try and visualize and perceive, not only in mathematical format, but by mere means of conceptual format as well. And so, if we ourselves look at the planet as a constant fluctuation of time and of place, and as we ourselves travel from place to place, we are traveling from and through time to another time, then traveling through space and time is merely a daily nuance which we take granted of. And the means by which you actually do so allows you to take greater advantage upon the time and, in a way, travel through slipstreams of time. And one man's starport is another man's airport terminal, where by utilizing the slipstreams of space, we are able to more efficiently and effectively travel through time itself to different regions of space, defining itself as a different time. Now, a lot of people mistakenly associate the advancement of time with progress itself, which isn't necessarily a truth, because we can go back to other times before this moment in which certain ideals may have seemed to be more effectively reached, and by doing so, they have been progressed towards that ideal more effectively than, some future moment in time. So traveling forward in time doesn't always necessarily mean advancement. Sure, it's advancement in the river of the flow of time itself, but isn't necessarily in an advancement or progress of a change of reaching a pinnacle of an ideal. And so, through the advancement of time, the achievement or the attainment of what people perceive to be advancement isn't necessarily always reached. However, we need to look at time more of as like a place rather than something which is, just like this esoteric thing which in itself is not related to space itself. Because what I'm doing by traveling through time, like let's just hypothetically state that we have a time machine. And by having this time machine, let's say that I am in actuality able to go back in time to a time previous to this one. Now, by hypothetically stating that I'm able to do so, I am in a sense allocating myself to a different space, because time and space themselves are directly linked. And so by going to a different time, I'm merely myself going to a different location. And because if we perceive, all things to be infinite, then that means that all locations themselves will become an eventuality. And for me to actually gain myself in the position itself that I wish to gain, more so than it being a determined factor of time itself, is more so a factor of me allocating myself into, a space which is designated by a certain time or correlated to a certain time. And the whole statement itself, hypothetically saying that I can go back in time, kind of defeats the purpose and what we define as life itself. Because life, as stated earlier, requires, this sense of progress, this sense of change, which is our sense of time. And, the eternal flow of things themselves, which give me a sense of change. And this sense of change allows me to experience. And as I experience, I gain the sense of life. Now, let's say that I myself was able to reach speeds that of, the speed of light in a vacuum, which in a lot of ways is a very odd thing to try to imagine, because what we see is actually the reflection of light. So what you're doing is you're traveling faster than perception, and you're traveling faster than the ability is in which you could actually perceive yourself in relation to your surroundings. So it would almost be like everything itself would just turn black, because you're traveling faster than the ability in which you could actually perceive the world. And so the other odd thing that we come across when we contemplate these notions is that our mass has a direct, linkage to our speed, and the energy in which, we potentially house while increasing our speed and motion. And what we see is that with the increase of speed comes the increase in energy and mass itself. And as soon as we near light speed and overcome light speed, our mass, in a sense, becomes infinite. And upon doing so, we find ourselves in correlation to some other conceptualized notions about some things which previously themselves had mass of infinite quantities. Are you ready to go home, Rock? Because by doing so, if we ourselves are able to attain, the velocity of such a description, then, we're able to go back, in a sense, to the beginning of all things themselves. And what does this necessarily relate to? Something that's infinite itself. It sounds a lot like a lot of people's description of what God is. And in a lot of ways, what science decrees as the initial expanse of all things, which is the causal event for all things to be themselves today. And so, in a way, the paradox presents itself, because in such a place, and with the ability to experience such an event, we ourselves truly have no experience, because what defines experience is being broken, because we no longer need to conform to what we deem experience, and in so doing no longer can experience what gives us our sense of life. Because by becoming infinite, we ourselves become the causal event of all things that are. And so, in a way, by doing so, you yourself are becoming what many people define as God. And so the conflict presents itself where you can't necessarily experience that without death, because it contradicts life itself. And thus we gain the lieu of paradoxes, which associate themselves to traveling back in time. Now, traveling in the sense as though we're chasing time is another thing to contemplate on its own, because, we can trail time, we can trail light without necessarily breaking the borders and boundaries which define experience, and in so doing destroy what it means to actually be alive. And in a lot of ways, these are practically accomplished in our day-to-day life by means of transportation and by means of separation from the external world and reducing friction and allowing us to, in a way, maneuver through slipstreams of time itself. And it's kind of funny because in a lot of ways, to actually find yourself in another time, you actually have to sit very still for long and extended amounts of time, which, if you think about it, is very perplexing, because it's almost like you're sitting there waiting for the time to be, rather than you yourself chasing the time which you wish to gain. So no longer are you, kind of running after this time and place in which you wish to find yourself within. You're simply waiting patiently for it to actually become. And so it's almost, again, like I stated before, all places already are, and to actually be there, you simply have to wait for them to be in the right place at the right time, and you'll find yourself being where it is that you wish to be. And, it's all about just patiently awaiting for it to actually manifest itself, which is, in a lot of ways, kind of ironic, like I said before, to actually travel through space and time itself in the most effective manner, which we know is by actually ourselves just sitting still. Whether it be by boat or by automobile or by airplane or by some means of extraterrestrial space craft, we are then able to maneuver ourselves to different locations in time. And if we actually think about it that way, then we can come to realizations of how to actually travel back in time and to other places in time, whether it be forward notions of time or other locations of the exact same moment in time, however, in a different region of space itself. And what I'm talking about is by sitting still, we're able to, say, open a book, a history book, which in a lot of ways is merely like some physical manifestation of a time that was, which has been closed off from the external world and is now just reflecting its light, which has been preserved. Like let's say that you have a couple 100-year-old encyclopedia. Now, this encyclopedia, for it to actually maintain the light which we perceive to be the words within the book itself and images, must itself be closed off from the rest of the world. Just like we ourselves must be closed off to gain the physical and mechanical advantage to us ourselves travel through time and space. Information must do the same thing, otherwise it will degrade through time in a much more rapid manner due to the friction that time itself places upon objects. Now what we're doing here is we're looking at normal day-to-day activities which in a lot of ways have significant impact and meaning when looked upon through some, advanced mathematical and conceptual relation to the universe that otherwise would just be overlooked as something which is a day-to-day normal thing, but in a lot of ways holds a lot of magical significance to it and is a lot more complex than one might actually initially perceive. So by looking through books, we're able to once again see light, which has taken a long time to reflect to our eyes, just as if gazing off into outer space at distant stars. And, all light really is information. And the photon itself is what allows us to perceive this information as it, reflects off of objects. And it's pretty amazing if you actually think about it that way. And, what if we ourselves were able to, in a sense, alter the timeline which has already passed? Now, do we break the laws that we previously spoke of, which give us a sense of experience of life by almost having ourselves be out of control over it? Well, what I mean is that a lot of people wish to, change history by the means of going back in time. Now, if you yourself change the representation of what history was by altering those devices which reflect light from a time that's already passed, then in a sense, you change history itself. And to explain this in layman's terms, the alteration of books and of knowledge, which itself light then reflects off of, which gives us a different perception of what has already passed. And by giving us a different perception of what has already passed, it gives us a different perception of how things currently are. And so the actual alteration of history and of events which have already passed really isn't, too far-fetched as it may actually have once seemed, due to the fact that all you really have to do is change the devices and intercept the reflection of light from a distant place in the past. And all you have to do is change the devices or the material objects which would reflect the notions which you yourself wish to change. And so it really is, in a lot of ways, time travel back to another time to change the present and to possibly change the future isn't necessarily something that's so far-fetched. Because like I said, just barely, all you have to do is find the slipstream of time, the continuous flow of time, and you merely have to go back to all locations within that time, find the material which is reflecting light, which you yourself don't necessarily want to be reflected in that manner, and alter the way in which it is reflected, and in a sense, you're changing history, which will, in effect, change the way in which the moment is. And, we can say, okay, you kind of found a loophole within the whole timeline thing, and you're not necessarily actually changing the truth of the events which actually occurred. You're merely changing the perception of truth, and what you're actually posing as a historical event isn't actually changing the truth of history itself. It's merely changing what we ourselves believe to be true. But by changing what we ourselves believe to be true, then in a sense we're changing history, and we're going back in time, and we're changing the way in which people perceive things now. So it's kind of like a cheater's way to travel back in time. without necessarily breaking any laws which don't allow you to experience life in the general sense that we know it, or the general sense in which we perceive it must be, beyond our capabilities to understand it any other way. Now, you might say, how is it in other ways in which we ourselves travel through time by merely staying still? I eloquently described how, by staying still, we're able to transport ourselves through time in other geographical locations, either previously or simultaneously, through devices such as computers and the internet, or through devices such as means of communication with telephones and of televisions. We are able to simultaneously view instances and occurrences as they occur during the same time, but in different regions of space. Now, is there some way in which we ourselves can actually control light? And by controlling light and what it is that we perceive to be experience, are we able to alter the timeline of events, so to speak? Well, in one of my previous videos, I discussed one of the most odd things in which we experience in our world today, which is motion pictures. It is the actual manipulation of light in which we are able to, in a lot of ways, travel through space to another time. Because if we look at the vastness of the cosmos, then all another space is just merely a given amount of time to actually reach the physical manifestation of where it is that we're at from the initial expanse of all things. Because, eventually they're going to become an eventuality. And so by traveling through space, we're merely traveling through the amount of time it would take for this place to, in a way, align itself or become an actuality. And what is the one way in which we actually do that in a very fluid and effective manner today, where we actually alter the flow of light to perceive a reality which, in a sense, is merely the alignment of certain things to give us what it is that we're perceiving. And in a lot of ways, that is actually through motion pictures. And so, just like with other ways to travel through time, where you're sitting still in one place and it doesn't actually necessarily seem like you're moving, but in a lot of ways, you're moving through a lot of space, because, space is directly linked to light. And so when you're viewing motion pictures, the light which is actually being in a sense, directed towards your vision is allowing you to travel to that space and allowing you to travel to another time. And just because it seems like a cheater's way to describe space travel doesn't make it actually any less fascinating than it really is. And in a lot of ways it reminds me to, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and, space may be the final frontier, but it's made in a Hollywood basement, so to speak. And in a lot of ways it actually holds truth. And a lot of these artists, which many people don't necessarily deem to be intellectuals, were highly intellectual, actually. Just because they kind of express the notion through a different format rather than equations, and rather than physical and actual, biological movement through three-dimensional space, where the space itself is in essence being moved to you through your visualization and to your central nervous system. So there you have it. We're all travelers through time and space, and we're able to travel through time and space by many different means. And, it's almost like the world itself houses all the space which we are actually capable of reaching without actually ever leaving the planet. And so, a lot of those ancient notions seem a lot more actual, philosophical, like, notions of how things actually are, rather than just some religious nonsense and voodoo. When you start to perceive things in that manner, a lot of those things start to make more sense, and you say, hey, they were actually onto something here. However, it's just through, our use of language today, and through the translations from then to now, we've misconstrued what it was that they were talking about, and we've given it a sense of impracticality, where it was in actuality practical itself. So there you have it. Enjoy being a space traveler, and all the dimensions that you enter. And be safe upon your journeys through the interstellar highways of life. Not causing a crash in reality by trying to physically occupy the same space as somebody else, which may be detrimental towards your health and of others. And that, my friends, is profoundly idiotic. Hey, Rocky, how was the drive? Hey. Good? Did you like that? Yay! Good boy. Come on, boy. Come on.